Good afternoon. I'm John Mark Shanghyo. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and we are delighted to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, What Lies Ahead? A Community Conversation on the New Administration. I want to give a special welcome to the Religion, War, and Peace class. We're going to be talking today about some of the issues facing our nation and our world, and I hope, students, that you use events like this one to prepare you to engage, to innovate, and to lead on these issues. We're counting on you. So the first concrete step that you can take is to make sure that you sign the class attendance sheet on the information table in the lobby, okay? This afternoon's community conversation is part of a project at the center called Recovering Truth, Religion, Journalism, and Democracy in a Post-Truth Era, which is sponsored by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation's program in theology. So if you're all here, you've probably seen CSRC materials, and as you can probably tell from those materials and this afternoon's event, we at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict are devoted to increasing understanding of the complex connection between religion and conflict, and the role this plays in our nation and in our world. We do this through the production of research, through student programs, and through public education and public engagement events like today's conversation. There are two upcoming events in particular that I want to highlight. In just 2 weeks, on Thursday, February 6, Emmy Award-winning investigative broadcaster and journalist Laila Al-Aryan will deliver the annual Hart Nikachos Lecture in Peace Studies. Her lecture is titled Reporting Gaza. Second, on April 9, we'll be right back here in Pima Auditorium continuing the work of the Recovering Truth Project, and David French, political commentator and New York Times columnist, is coming to talk with us about truth, religion, and the rule of law. So please mark your calendars, and if you haven't already, please sign up for our mailing list and pick up our spring event calendar with Alex and Dawn in the lobby. Details about our events can always be found at our website, csrc.asu.edu. And recordings of this and many of our past events can be found on our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to follow us there and on our other social media. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, friends, here at the Center, we depend on your partnership to do this important work. We just finished our end-of-the-year giving season, and I want to thank everyone that gave to CSRC in the last year. You are a vital part of making this event and events like it possible. Now, if you'd like to partner with us in this critical work, or if you want to increase your commitment, please don't wait until the end of the year. Let's start the year out strong. You can visit our online giving page, csrc.asu.edu/support. Or at the end of this evening's event, please find myself, our communications manager, Dawn, our event coordinator, Alex, and we'd be very glad to help you find ways to give. So, at this time, we'll get to the business of the afternoon, but I'd like everyone to please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Today's event is being live streamed, so hello and welcome to our digital audience. And for those participating in person, all of you here, I invite you to a reception following the event. We'll have some refreshments out in the lobby. And now for our last bit of housekeeping. After hearing from our panelists, we'll open up the floor for your questions. There'll be a mic down there. And for those of you who are joining us online, if you have questions, you can email us at csrc@asu.edu. Now, I have to say, we probably won't be able to get to every question tonight, even if you're standing in line. But out of respect for one another and so that we can get to as many questions as possible, please only ask a single question and be as clear and succinct as you can. If we don't get to your question during the Q&A, many of our panelists will be hanging around for our reception, and I encourage you to continue the conversation over cookies and coffee. Okay. So let's get to it. During his inaugural address 3 days ago, President Trump laid out a vision for American political life that he promised would usher in a golden age of America. He followed up these statements with nearly 50 executive actions affecting a wide range of major issues, including immigration, gender, and our military, economic, defense, and foreign policies. Now, the sweeping range of the president's vision, the initiatives that he's promised to enact, and the effects they will have on the lives of people are already making waves, not only in the formal institutions of government, but across our society and world. This afternoon, we're privileged to have an esteemed panel of ASU faculty associated with the center, whose work covers many of the issues on the president's agenda. We've asked them to start off our community conversation with short 5 minutes, panelists, 5 minutes, 5-minute presentations discussing a particular issue within their area of expertise, after which we'll engage together in Q&A and community conversation. Now, in a minute, I'm going to let each panelist introduce the specifics of the topic they're going to cover themselves, but as they prepared their presentations, I've asked each presenter to consider 3 general questions. First, what can we expect from the Trump administration in the next 4 years? Second, how does religion or religious beliefs of Americans bear upon the pressing issues facing our country? And finally, and I think very importantly, what are your hopes for this administration, and what can we as people do to constructively engage these important issues? So, with that background established, I'd like to introduce this afternoon's panel. Panelists, give a wave when I introduce you. Stella Rouse is the director of the Hispanic Research Center and professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Henry Thomson is a political economist and associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Daniel Rothenberg is co-director of the Future Security Initiative and professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Luke Perez is assistant professor of civic education in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Tracy Fessenden is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and the Steve and Margaret Forster Professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. John Carlson is Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict and Associate Professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Let's take a moment to welcome our panelists. So now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Stella to kick us off.
Thank you, John Mark. Asking academics to hold a talk to 5 minutes is like asking a bull in a china shop not to break china, but I will do my best to adhere to the 5 minutes. So my topic assignment for this wonderful conversation is issues of immigration and migration. And of course, there's nothing going on currently having to do with that. So I struggled really hard to come up with material. So I just wanted here briefly to kind of set the stage and the context for, I think, some of the things that have to do with immigration and migration and probably other things that we'll be talking about in this panel. But this is a sort of a graph of the issues that were most important in to voters in the 2024 election. And, well, now I can't. Oh, my goodness. Oh, there we go. Okay. And we can see where immigration ranks on this, right, for all registered voters, particularly for Trump supporters, and not so much for Harris supporters, but certainly an issue that was at the top of the list of most important issues to voters this election. And I also highlight the fact that in work that I have done and others have put forward, it's really hard, particularly in this election, to sort of separate immigration and the economy. I think they're pretty intrinsically tied, and in surveys that I have done and that I have seen, the economy oftentimes masks concerns about immigration, right? And so I think it's important to think about those two topics together as we discuss the issue of immigration. Something else to put into context in this election was certainly the mantra of a crisis at the border that we heard about during the election cycle and you know, ever since Trump has run for president again, which has been the last 4 years, right? More than 3/4 of Americans describe the situation at the border as a crisis or a major problem, right? A majority want to see immigration to the US decreased. By the way, this is the first time Gallup has done this tracking for many years about whether people want immigration to increase, decrease, or stay the same. And it's the first time since like 2002 that a majority of Americans want to see legal immigration in the US decreased. And we can see the breakdown by party ID in those numbers. Furthermore, I don't have this here, but a number of surveys also showed a majority, a slight majority, but a majority of Americans wanting to see mass deportation. Okay, Arizona is certainly at the forefront of the issue having to do with immigration. And I just briefly want to highlight that Prop 314, which pretty much gives law enforcement the ability to arrest and then hold for deportation undocumented migrants, as well as issues having to do with fentanyl, that it passed by an overwhelming majority, okay? Across the board in terms of subgroups, including Latinos, by the way. A majority of Latinos supported Prop 314, and I'll come back to Latinos in a minute toward the end of my time here. So, Trump says he has a mandate to do a whole lot of things, particularly on the issue of immigration. The biggest mandate in 129 years, quote unquote. That's not true. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, right? And when we talk about what we can do as a country in terms of having our voices heard, in terms of issues like immigration and other things, we need to keep these numbers in mind, right? He won 49.9% of the popular vote. That's not a majority, okay? The popular vote margin was 1.5 percentage points, which was smallest of any president since Richard Nixon since 1968. He won the Electoral College by 86 votes, smaller than George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. I'm not going to go through this whole list. For an interest of time, I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A, but here are some of the provisions that have come across from his executive orders having to do with immigration. The ending birthright citizenship has gotten a lot of attention. Just a little while ago, a judge basically blocked his executive order and saying that it was probably the most blatant violation of the Constitution that he had seen, and this is a Reagan appointee judge who said that. Really quickly, right, ending the CPB program, restating the Remain in Mexico, and then immigration raids, right, which is one of the big issues that we're talking about, and really currently, right, is threatening, Trump administration is threatening to withhold funds from sanctuary cities and to prosecute local officials who don't cooperate with these immigration raids. And then also the refugee issue that has come up where he has pretty much suspended the refugee program in the US, okay? So really quickly, and I'll talk about this more in the Q&A, the role of religion. This just shows the breakdown of religious affiliation in the US. You can see a huge number of unaffiliates. Are you counting my time with tech support? Okay. The role of religion for Latinos, we can see at least a quarter, or about a quarter, are Hispanic Protestants. And I have just a couple more slides, right? We can see that Christian nationalism, there is a part of the Latino community that is part of Christian nationalism, and that's an important topic as well that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, right? And this is my last slide here. But one of the things that I'd like to discuss and happy to discuss with everyone is sort of the evolving Latino identity and how that informs issues like immigration and how we think about a majority of Latinos supporting Proposition 314. This shows a graph where if you believe the majority group in the US, which are white Americans, are discriminated against, you're much more likely to support restrictive immigration reform. Whereas if you believe that minorities in this country are being discriminated against, you're much less likely to support restrictive immigration reform. And with that, I'll wrap up and turn it over to the next participant. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Stella. I was asked to speak a little about Trump and the economy, and I think it's great timing to come straight after that very interesting presentation on immigration, because as Stella mentioned, immigration and the economy are intrinsically linked in American public discourse, and that is to a certain extent a historic legacy of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is an economic nationalist. Donald Trump basically rejects hundreds of years of economic theory, which could be predominantly summarized as liberal economic theory. Donald Trump is an economic nationalist and does not believe in things like globalization, free trade, free flows of immigration as things as economic or social goods. So tariffs have always been a big part of Donald Trump's economic policy views. If you go back to the 1980s, in fact, Donald Trump was espousing views on tariffs that are essentially identical to the views that he espouses today, except for then he was railing against imports from Japan. Today he rails against imports from China. Trump's always believed that trade is a type of zero-sum game. If you import more than you export, you're losing. Now, every economist in the world since Adam Smith and David Ricardo in the 19th century would disagree with that, but that's what Trump believes. And so he's always supported tariffs and the attempt to restrict America's imports at any cost in order to therefore reduce the trade deficit. So I think in the coming Trump administration, we can definitely expect more tariffs. He's already claimed that he's going to put a 10% tariff on all imports from China on the 1st of February. He's threatened to put imports of up to 25% on imports from Canada and Mexico. I believe at the same time, whether he does those things remains unclear. But it's also important to bear in mind that he's going to make these changes based on a world trade system that was already fundamentally destabilized by his first administration. So the World Trade Organization, the multilateral trade system, has not really been working properly since the first Trump administration. He already renegotiated NAFTA once. It seems that he is quite happy to keep the world trade system in a state of perpetual disarray through his second administration. So I think that we can expect that that will continue. Another thing that Trump seems to support now, maybe more than in his first administration, is state planning of the economy and industrial policy. This is a new move that we're seeing on the nationalist right emerge, the idea that the government should be picking winners, that the government should be subsidizing and protecting specific industries. This is something that traditionally was associated with the left, but we now see associated with the right. Donald Trump seems to be a big supporter of this. We see it with semiconductors, obviously, here in Arizona. The construction of some of the new chip fabs has been associated with some of these policies. He also seems quite committed to protecting the American auto industry. This was present in the renegotiation of NAFTA, and he looks committed to trying to even increase protection for the auto industry going forward. He seems to want to protect industries as small as, for example, the ports, the longshoremen. He wants to prevent automation of their jobs and to protect jobs in that particular sector. And now there seems to be this nascent alliance between Trump and the nationalist right and the tech industry, including big interests like OpenAI. There was a big investment by OpenAI coordinated by the Trump administration just announced yesterday. So those things I think are also going to continue and go in directions that, to be frank, are quite unpredictable. Because at the same time as Trump turns his back on liberal economic theory, on globalization, on immigration, on trade, on state intervention in the economy, picking winners, etc., he still has some aspects of his policies that remain free market. So you'll recall that he wants to reduce restrictions or regulations on energy markets to try and lower the cost of energy. He also has created this new government agency that's supposed to reduce the scope of the federal government by reducing the number of employees and also reduce the number of regulations imposed by the federal government. So as you can see, there's not really a lot of coherence to these economic policy prescriptions. And that's a major reason why I think economists don't really know where the economy is going to go next year. I just got the time thing, which is absolutely fine. There was a survey published yesterday in the Wall Street Journal of economists asking whether the economy is going to grow next year, whether inflation is going to increase, etc. And I think it's fair to say that none of them really have strong views. Most people think that inflation is going to be slightly higher under Trump than it has been the last couple of years, or some of his policies are going to have inflationary effects, especially immigration restrictions and tariffs. But in terms of the growth trajectory of the economy, I don't think people really know where it's going to go. I hate to punt myself on what I think the future is going to hold, but I also think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Amid these big policy agenda items that are pushing in different directions, I just don't know which way things are going to turn out. I think a lot of it is going to hinge on Trump's relationship with the very narrow Republican majorities in Congress, and over some very fraught negotiations over which aspects of his agenda he's able to pursue versus others. So with that, I will conclude within my 5 minutes, I think, and pass it on to my next panelist. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I was asked to talk about foreign policy. Is this working okay? Good. Okay. And just to echo, this is probably, everyone's probably going to say this, but there is an enormous degree of uncertainty that we can feel. I think it's not only uncertainty because we actually don't know what's going to happen. I think, the promises have been so grandiose, both if you're a believer in the MAGA movement and if you're not. And we don't really know where to turn for a grounding in what will happen, which, although we have some clues, right? I mean, at least foreign policy, as I didn't know this, but the slide you showed, Stella, showed that people weren't all that concerned about foreign policy in comparison to other issues. Not surprising, for all kinds of reasons. This was very much an election about, I think, the domestic space and domestic feelings. But of course, the world is out there. And there's some lessons I think we can take from the first Trump administration. I mean, there were 4 years under Trump the first time around. And among the most, so there's several ways to understand this. One is sort of just in terms of framing, we're trying to think what's going to happen in the future. Look, we just don't know, but there's like a maximalist framing. What's the most that could happen given the claims made in the campaign and the claims made, in the very first week of the administration? And then what's the sort of minimalist? And then add to that, particularly in foreign policy, there's many things that are likely to happen that we can't foresee. And they will produce crises, no doubt. And those crises require responses. And those responses can't be planned for, many of them, and they won't be. And then we can also look back at what were the previous 4 years. What did we learn? And we did learn some things. We don't know which of these things will be most salient. But one is that, Donald Trump is very keen on enormous levels of simplification of complicated things. Just think of it seems like a dream, but the first Trump administration was premised very much on immigration, and there was an immense amount of talk about the wall, this thing that was going to somehow affect policy substantively. And there was a lot of, refurbishing of walls, and there were some walls built, and Mexico's going to pay for it. That entire discussion dissipated. And in the end of the day, it didn't really mean much, even if the entire wall had been built in all the ways that was imagined. And even if somehow Mexico had paid for it, it's unlikely this would have made a big difference, because what drives migration, as all studies show, are all sorts of factors that are far more complicated than whether there's a barrier, that demarcates the space. And we see this with some of the stranger moments, like the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, it's funny, right? But let's be honest. I don't know. There's a river that divides parts of Texas and Mexico, and we call it the Rio Grande, and in Mexico it's called Rio Bravo. And that hasn't been a big problem. And who knows about the Gulf of America? But in any case, so we've seen there's a lot of simplification, and that doesn't really work. That is to say, the world isn't simple because you say it is. And similarly, we've seen a number of big outlays. Like, think of the North Korea policy. I mean, it's the first time a U.S. president met with Kim Jong-un, the head of North Korean government. And what came of it? Well, not a real significant change in much of anything. It didn't change the nuclear program in North Korea. It didn't really change the U.S. posture. It upset a lot of allies, but even that upsetness didn't change our position actually in, say, South Korea. So what did it really mean? We don't know. We don't know. Now, so we don't know moving forward what all that signifies. But I thought I would try very briefly to go through some hot spots because that makes some sense. There's the sort of North America story, Canada and Mexico slightly talked about. Who knows? If there really were 25% tariffs put on February 1st, not that far away, it's hard to imagine what that would do. It's also hard to imagine that will happen. It would be transformative for the relations. It would be transformative to industries. Then you look at something like the conflict in Gaza. I mean, it is clearly partly the incoming Trump administration that led to that ceasefire. We're in stage one of a three-stage process. And both the Biden administration and the Trump administration get to take credit for that. Who knows what's going to happen, but the severity of the suffering there and the complexity of that situation is not going to lend itself to an easy answer. There won't be, but there are possibilities certainly for a better situation. Syria, massive transformation. There is no Bashar al-Assad. Interesting question there. Will the U.S. continue to support the SDF in northeastern Syria, our core allies in the overthrow of ISIS? A very complicated situation. Will that complexity play out positively? Will the administration be able to deal with it? Think of something like Africa as a fascinating example. Maybe it's not even a place we can talk about in that way, but the data, the UN's just released some data to show that its population will double and 39% of people in the world will be in Africa in 100 years or so. There is no policy for Africa. Will there be a policy? We don't know, but that's a good example of a situation where global trends and things that have nothing to do with what the U.S. can control are enormously impactful on what happens in the world. So I just leave it with one final thought. In the post 9/11 era, which we're living in, one of the biggest takeaways is that the U.S. doesn't have the power it thinks it has to affect things in different places. And I'm sure that we will see in the next 4 years some vindication of that story. That is to say, the U.S. cannot control the world, and whatever the Trump administration does in foreign policy is going to show us that, and we will see.
Hi, thanks everyone. I want to start with the last question. What are my hopes for this administration? I would be remiss as a professor of civics if I didn't start there. My hopes are the same for every presidential administration. I hope the president is successful. I hoped Biden was successful. I hoped Obama was successful and George W. Bush was successful, because when our presidents are successful, America is successful. And that's my general outlook, and has been at least since I enlisted in the Air National Guard in the late 90s. Like, I've just sort of had this attitude that even if I disagree with specific policies, that generally we can move forward. And so that's my hope. I'm sure I will have many disagreements with particular policies of this administration going forward, and I will engage in the political process. And I encourage everyone, especially the young people, to do that as well. Not by yelling and screaming hashtags on Twitter and Instagram or whatever, but actively just getting involved. Like, go into your city council meetings or actually reading the newspaper and figuring out what's going on in the world. I think we all could do better if we engage, more civically and civic-mindedly about the major issues, because the more that you know about what's going on, the better involved you will be able to be. As for what to expect, I have 4 sort of broad points. I'll get to as many as I can. I think generally Trump governs on instinct in the area of foreign policy and strategy. I'm sort of a second fiddle to this foreign policy outlook, but looking at the big picture, he doesn't have sort of an ideological bent in the way that we normally think of our presidents coming to office with a fully formed political philosophy for how America should conduct the world. So he's able to move tactically, but he sort of often lacks a kind of long-term strategic outlook. Nevertheless, I took the time this week to reread the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was written by Elbridge Colby, who has just returned to the same office with a promotion. And so there's a lot that we can learn by looking at that and sort of thinking through what's changed, what they got right in 2018, what they got wrong, what they didn't see. Third, I think there's going to be a huge emphasis to reduce a lot of the small proxy wars, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, in order to put most of his strategic effort in areas like China, and all of the other areas, domestic policy and things. He sees those, I think, as a distraction from trying to achieve things that he wants to achieve. And then last, the staffing of his administration in some ways is better and in some ways worse than it was 4 years ago. You're seeing individuals who have a lot of experience, who know what they're doing, some who are less so, but more importantly, down at the lower levels, there's sort of hit and miss. So that's the overview. Broadly, where am I at? I got about 2 minutes. Okay. Broadly, I like to think of Trump trying to think of him like a Venn diagram. He's got a policy triad. He doesn't have, again, a vision, but last time he had 3 broad goals. This is kind of a heuristic. There's nothing scientific about this. He wanted to undo Obama's legacy. He wanted to have this sort of MAGA, which back then was maybe sort of stoking the working class grievances, and now it's more about retribution for his legal troubles. And then the last was anything that sort of made the left sort of go up in arms. You know, you might think of it as like hashtag liberal tears, you know. And any policy issue that landed in 2 or 3 of those areas is going to be of high salience to him. And in areas of foreign policy or domestic policy, you can kind of intuitively grasp, like, this is, I think, where he's going. In the 2018 National Defense Strategy, they already listed things like Russia and China being the long-term threat. They saw, they used terms like strategic atrophy to describe the Obama and Bush years. And so they wanted a more restrained foreign policy in order to focus on big picture ideas. So you might see some things heading on there. Recently, Trump has taken credit for the Israel-Gaza deal by threatening all hell to pay if one wasn't reached, because he gets the benefit of getting the deal through and getting a ceasefire. But if anything bad comes about it, well, that was, Biden's deal, not mine. But from him, it allows him one less thing to worry about as he takes office and has other things to do. I think we might see something similar going on in Ukraine. And then lastly, just to take 2 big confirmations, Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. One, a career politician who has a lot of experience. A lot of people look at him as a very serious person. He has an impeccable record in the Senate on human rights. You might see him pushing forward a lot of things about international religious freedom, for instance, and other things. And Hegseth is just not a career politician. He's not really managed a whole lot of things. And the DoD is a massive enterprise. If it were a corporation, it would be the largest in the world. And a lot of his undersecretaries are going to have to do the work. And we're not really sure how much experience they're going to have. I just got an email or text from a friend the other day. He has a former student who was a freshman in 2019 and is now a deputy undersecretary somewhere in the State Department. That's not normally someone you would think staffing that level of a role. This could be good or bad, depending on whether or not you actually agree with Trump. If you want him to succeed and get things done, this is not good, because this is somebody who's not going to have the experience necessary to meet crises as they emerge, because they will emerge. But on the other hand, if you don't like him, maybe they're not getting as much done as they're trying to achieve. So those are the 4 big areas, and I'll pass the time off. Thank you.
I was invited to talk about gender, and I'm going to focus on men. Trump won the presidency narrowly twice. He was the only major party nominee to run against a woman as the other major party's presidential nominee. Voters who made the difference between 2024 and 2020, when Trump lost to Joe Biden, were those who stayed home or who switched their Biden votes to Trump, or who came out to vote for the very first time, millions of whom checked the box for Trump without even bothering to fill out the rest of the ballot. Folks who shared their reasons for doing so have given a range of explanations for their voting behavior. I have yet to find one who has said, I did what I did specifically to keep a woman from becoming president. This answer does not appear on any drop-down menu. It was not on Stella's list from YouGov. It doesn't figure in the post-election analyses, and it's not easy to pin down. But if you suspect that unwillingness to countenance a woman in the Oval Office might have played some role in this election, that it characterizes some portion of the electorate now being acknowledged for its efforts, you might find ample confirmation for your suspicions in the events of the last several days. When Mark Zuckerberg met with Stephen Miller at Mar-a-Lago in late December, according to the New York Times, Miller told Zuckerberg that Trump would be going to war against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the federal government. And not only there, that if Zuckerberg wanted to, that Zuckerberg would need to bring Meta in line with the president's vision if he wanted to thrive in the new administration. Soon after that meeting, Zuckerberg announced that Meta was ending its fact-checking program. In part, he said, because it was offending the fragile sensibilities of men. Here's Zuckerberg, quote, "I do think a lot of our society has become very like, I don't even know the right word for it, but it's kind of like neutered or like emasculated." This is Zuckerberg in conversation with Joe Rogan. He added, "I think having a culture that like celebrates the aggression a bit more has its own merits that are really positive." In that spirit, Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth introduced himself to the American people by promising to bring warrior culture back to the U.S. military. On his first full day in the job, Trump fired the Coast Guard's first female admiral, Linda Lee Fagan, the first woman to lead a branch of the U.S. Armed Services. Per Fox News, the Trump administration believes Fagan prioritized DEI policies to the supposed detriment of the Coast Guard. These policies including, her policies included recruiting women to the military and preventing sexual assault in the military. On the same day, the president also revoked the workplace discrimination rules enacted by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965. He attacked these 50-year-old rules as, quote, radical DEI preferencing. The Trump administration said federal employees would face consequences if they failed to report colleagues pursuing DEI efforts by other names. Now, these efforts obviously do not single out women for harm. They lift rules preventing discrimination on the basis not only of gender, but of race and religion, sexuality, and disability. Moreover, there is no evidence that a broified tech is a better tech. A broified military is a better military. In this way, they hurt all of us. But I do want to stay with gender for just a moment. One of Trump's executive orders, of the very many he signed, actually does attempt to define two genders from the moment of conception. We can talk about that later. The interesting thing to me is that when gender is imagined as a strict binary, it can also become a zero-sum game. And you do not have to be a gender studies major to get this, trust me. When gender is imagined as a zero-sum game, expansion in one gendered domain can be experienced or defined as perilous contraction in the other. So that when women move into roles that were long filled by men, admiral, judge, episcopal bishop, presidential nominee, masculinity to this way of experiencing gender becomes an embattled space, a small space, a space of felt encroachment, opposition, and defensiveness. And what is toxic masculinity but a recipe for converting resentment and fragility into entitlement? A program for regaining ground felt to have been lost by whatever means. An anti-DEI executive, the anti-DEI executive orders described in a Fox News headline recently were described as a return to merit-based hiring. But we might think about this for a moment. If the idea is no longer to elevate the unqualified, the presumably unqualified in the interest of fairness, leaving aside the fact that they are white men, could there be a less qualified pick for Health and Human Services than someone who doesn't believe in vaccinating children? A less qualified pick for the Secretary of Defense than someone with next to no military experience who doesn't know the difference between the nations of East Asia and Southeast Asia? For starters, you can multiply examples. So these examples suggest that this is hardly a meritocracy. So what is it? What a number of his cabinet picks have in common with one another and with the president is that they have all been credibly accused of sexual assault against women. This is the masculine energy we've been hearing about. Masculinity defined over against and at the violent expense of women's flourishing. It is performative, oppositional, and yes, retributive. So the question is, whether women and men outside of his significant but fairly compact base of mostly Christian evangelicals are going to go along with this, and how many women and men inside the base of Christian supporters of Trump are going to go along with this. Christian or not, we all have resources for imagining masculinity otherwise, for insisting otherwise, for doing otherwise. And I look forward to talking about how in the Q&A. Thanks.
All right. I have been asked to, or volunteered to say something about civil religion and its rather poor prognosis under the new administration. Now, if you don't know what civil religion is, if you're one of those folks who gets a little bit allergic when you hear the word religion, you can start to feel the hives forming. Think of it as faith in democracy, or democratic faith. And when I say democracy, I don't simply mean elections and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, separation of powers. All of that's very important as well. But I mean something much broader. And that's really what the civil religion that I'm going to be talking about tries to do, which is to understand the American experience of self-government, its long history, its founding documents, its moments of trial, its moments of success, to envision and understand that experience against the backdrop of some kind of ultimate reality, right? Something grander, something more transcendent, in the light of higher truths about dignity, truths about freedom and equality, et cetera. And through reference to a kind of shared heritage of beliefs, of stories, of idioms, of symbols, events, et cetera. And inaugurations are wonderful places and occasions to get a glimpse of civil religion at its height. Literally at its height, if you want to look at the Bermudi fresco at the top of the Capitol Rotunda, where the apotheosis of Washington is what's on that ceiling fresco. So take a look at that. That's civil religion in a nutshell. But I think, let me say one thing about what civil religion is not. It's not just when any old politician says something about God. So as if a president might say that he was saved by God to make America great again. That doesn't simply by mentioning God count as civil religion. That's just simple messianism. And if you've come to some of our events over the years, you'll know that there are many folks who make a distinction between Christian nationalism and civil religion as well. So maybe more important than defining it is saying what it does. Why is it important? And I would say it fulfills three main functions that I'll kind of race through quickly here. Number one, it fulfills a ceremonial function. It lends gravitas, reverence to an event, and you see this in the prayers and benedictions and other things, and all the pageantry that takes place at an inauguration. So it should extend to the inaugural address as well. But if you listen to the address on Monday, it was anything but august and solemn. I mean, can you imagine Ronald Reagan saying something like "drill, baby, drill" in an inaugural address, right? Or could you imagine other presidents talking about wanting to be remembered as the greatest and most consequential election in the history of our country? I mean, you just don't say those kinds of things if you want to preserve the dignity of the office and the dignity of the nation. Number two, it serves a political function. Inaugurations and the civil religious components of it preserve unity. They remind us of, in spite of all of our infinite differences, all of our pluribus, our plurality, that there's still something that we have in common, right? So outgoing presidents try to help us to participate in peaceful transfer of power, usually anyway. Incoming presidents reach out to Americans who didn't vote for them. Trump used his address to brag about winning all the swing states, the popular vote, and he used the occasion of the Martin Luther King holiday on Monday to thank black voters and voters of color who voted for him. Again, not in keeping with what inaugural addresses seek to do. Finally, civil religion serves, most importantly, a prophetic role. It establishes standards by which presidents can be judged personally, their actions. So if a president should say, "We will be a nation full of compassion," as President Trump did on Monday, you would not expect that standard to be crushed less than 24 hours later when he scathingly condemns a bishop who says, "Have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared right now." If you've pledged to balance the scales of justice, you would not then expect a president to commute the sentences or pardon 1,500 people engaged in violent forms of insurrection, seditious conspiracy, attacks against police officers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, even William McKinley, whom President Trump referenced in his inaugural, used his address to condemn lynchings and mob violence. So finally, the prophetic role of civil religion and of their inaugurals remind us that there are moral criteria, there are higher criteria beyond personality and beyond the laws of government. The will of the people can be wrong. And take a look at the history of slavery, the history of religious and other forms of and racial persecution, et cetera, in our country. But what Trump said is that if you're thinking about those things or identifying those things, you're teaching our children to hate our country, right? You're teaching them to be ashamed of themselves. No, that's not what civil religion is about. So I would say that in sum, you might think of it as the moral backbone of the body politic. It helps put us on a path and on a setting where we can look at our imperfect past and try to think about how to perfect our union in the future by invigorating our moral aspirations.
Let's thank our presenters one more time. Well, thank you, everyone. You've given us quite a lot to consider, and more than that, thank you. You did admirably, especially for an academic panel, of sticking to the time. So we'll move into our Q&A shortly, but I want to get the ball rolling on our conversation with just one or two questions to our panelists for them to comment on, and then I'll open up the floor to all of your questions. I want to stick with the theme, first of all, of civil religion, but I want to take civil religion and religiosity beyond the abstract. John, you said that civil religion, one of its functions is to create national unity, and another function is to be prophetic. Well, the president, in his inaugural address, said, and I quote, "We will not forget our country, we will not forget our Constitution, and we will not forget our God." And he said this as in light of statements about national unity. So my question is this: beyond the general religiosity that President Trump was mentioning there, do you see religious institutions, and this is for the whole panel, do you see religious institutions or religious groups specifically, not general religion, affecting or being affected by the policies and issues that you discussed?
Is this for me here?
This is for everybody. I mean,
okay.
How do you see specific religious groups maybe entering the arena and the sphere of what you've discussed?
Well, I think one of the things that's important about civil religion is that it provides a broad framework for thinking and talking about national identity that does not in any way require or presuppose some other set of religious commitments. So, scholar Philip Gorski has done really important work to show the range of different, he's spoken here before, the range of different folks from more secular perspectives, Jewish perspectives, Catholics, and others to talk about how and what ways one can offer a fully inclusive and embracing idea, or at least a big umbrella in which to work. One of the things I'll say just briefly on American exceptionalism, which is one of the components of civil religion, and this really got me thinking. There's a way in which much of Trump's rhetoric in the inaugural address really captures this language of of this kind of zero-sum game. It's like we've got to look out for our freedom, we've got to look out for our sovereignty, our power, as if it's all, again, a zero-sum game. And that's really, really inconsistent with the kind of exemplary account of American exceptionalism that most past presidents have talked about. Because what that means to them is that the more that one, it's not a finite, freedom is not a finite good. It can be expanded. George Bush famously said it's not, America's gift to the world, it's God's gift to humanity. It's not like, if I get it, you can't have it kind of thing. And yet that's sort of the way that the whole approach is treated. And I was just struck by the mention of this zero-sum account in virtually every single one of these facets of talking about his administration. So anyway, that's not exactly a response to your question, John, but I wanted to make sure that we mention that because I think it's important.
Yeah, I just want to say I think the messiness of religion could get very interesting in the next 4 years, and I hope that it does. John Mark, you asked some questions about how specifically will religions be impacted by some of these policies. And I think about Catholic rights groups that work with people crossing the border, Jews who help women get abortions, evangelical Christians who might not be so keen on Trump's promise to shut down asylum because they are concerned about persecution of Christians abroad. These folks may not agree with each other, but they agree that what they are devoted to might be made more difficult under the Trump administration. I was also so pleased, of course, to hear Bishop Marianne Budde give an address that was very much a civil religious address. She talked about the unity of the nation, that we require the help of God to go forward in unity. But she certainly didn't mince words, and she didn't water down the message. So I think she shows that, I'm someone who I have suspicions of civil religion insofar as it can become very much, can slide very easily toward supporting whoever is in power. And she didn't do that. She didn't let that happen. So I think religion could really be an interesting space to watch. There are plenty of Mormons who are not happy about the new immigration conversation. There are lots of very conservative Christians, Catholic and Protestant, who are not very happy about the sexual licentiousness that seems to be celebrated by many folks in the MAGA movement. So it'll be interesting. I think it's a good time to be a student of religion.
The number of Americans identifying as having no religion, they're often called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, has been rising for about 15-ish, maybe 20 years, but may have peaked last year or the year before, depending on the survey data that's out there. I mention this because I think a lot of what's going on with a decline of civil religion and maybe even a decline in just general civility with one another is correspondent to that, because whether or not one is a Christian or a Muslim or any other religion, though, if you have religious faith, you sort of find yourself trying to become a sort of a better person. If this world is all you see, then the outlook you have seems to change, because someone who is politically opposed to you ends up becoming not just somebody that you can sort of disagree with, but maybe have some common ground with, but becomes an existential threat. And I think there's been a general decline probably since the last few years of the Bush administration, certainly through the Obama administration. Those of us who are old enough will remember when Obama said, Western Pennsylvanians cling to their guns and their religion. And he was a pretty religious man himself, but was already kind of engaging in what has become a metastasized phenomenon that's bipartisan, right? All Americans seem to have engaged in that in some way, shape, or form. If it's true that the nuns have sort of stopped and begin to decline, and Americans begin to rediscover religiosity, independent of whatever Trump does, I'm hopeful that maybe there will be a return to more general civility with one another.
I mean, part of what's so tricky about talking about anything to do with current Trump administration and the past Trump administration is separating, the discourse from the practice. Yeah, the discourse is so in your face, right? Every single statement is about your friend or foe. Everything is so overtly transactional, it's almost hard to process intellectually. But sometimes the actual practice, certainly this is true in the foreign policy sphere, right? The practice is nowhere near as intricate. Maybe it's not as well. Maybe partly because some of the practice isn't in the hands of the man who takes all the energy out of the room, who gets all of the attention. On the side of religion, one of the stranger aspects of at least the foreign policy perspective is, the world is a truly diverse place. The strangeness of this anti-DEI language is it has, it flies in the face of the reality of the world we actually live in. Maybe not DEI policies, whatever they might be, but just the fundamental, acceptance of the richness and challenges that come with difference. Just be concrete, what does it mean to negotiate with the People's Republic of China and their officials? It's surely something related to difference. The some of that has religious components as well. We will see how this plays out. I think part of what's strange about all of this moment is it's hard to focus. This is clearly the strategy of the administration, is to just, shock and awe, as they say. But things may not calm down, because calm is not the practice of the administration. But it will be interesting to see how exhausted people will become from the tone and quality, which, if it stays the same, will exhaust for sure.
Religion is well outside my area of expertise. I'll say two things. I think that religious groups are going to be affected by Trump's agenda insofar as if they can help with his agenda, they're going to benefit from it. And if they try and hinder it, they're going to have problems. And I think that, for example, churches here in Arizona that are trying to help people who are coming across the border, that might be providing shelter to those people, et cetera, are going to get implicated in Trump's immigration policies. I think that's probably going to happen. And the second thing I'll say is that Trump's turn away from economic orthodoxy as practiced by professional economists has in some ways been influenced by religious thinkers or political philosophers with right-wing conservative religious backgrounds. And so in a way, the turn away from liberal, I'm calling it liberal, but orthodox economic policy as practiced in economics departments at universities, that has also gone hand in hand with the growing influence of people who are very religious. So those are the two things I'd say about religion.
So oftentimes a reaction to a lot of the Trump policies is cruelty is the point. I think that religion can play a really important role in when we talk about civil religion, about countering cruelty with mercy, about countering cruelty with empathy and sympathy, about seeing others as human beings and not the other and your enemy. So I think religion has a really important role to play in terms of tempering down the temperature of our politics, in terms of humanizing the policies that are being put forward. It's easy to be against a migrant crossing the border when you see him on television or when he's painted in some sort of political ad and you don't have a sense of what that individual is going through. That's a different perspective or mindset that you may have. And I think civic religion, civil religion, has a role to play in that, in trying to humanize how we think about the policies that may come down the pike over the next 4 years.
I've got plenty more questions, but this is a community conversation, so I think we really want to hear from you. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. If you'll join us down here at the mic, we'll just take them first come, first served. You want to take this mic down? Yeah, Alex is going to bring it.
So I'm here with one of my classmates right now, and we're both in a class that focuses on the impact. Oh, the mic's not on? Oh, it is. So, can you guys hear me now? Okay. So I'm here with one of my classmates right now, and we're both in a class that focuses on democracies and how they last, how they erode. So, kind of tying it to that subject, I was wondering, we see this all over the news. What do you guys believe is the current state of democracy? And are we set to see a decline in democracy? Are we set to see it consolidated? What are your perceptions about the future of democracy in our country?
I'll take the first stab. I think generally democracy is particularly messy. It's always chaotic. As bad as things are right now, it's not 1863, right? It's maybe not even, if you talk to, maybe some of you are old enough to remember this. I am a little younger than this, but it's not 1968. Chicago. So there are times in which democracy has always been a very messy, contentious business. That's the whole point, is to allow that political space to get contested and work through towards a unity of action, right? Allowing government to reach some kind of consensus, even if it's very fragile, and even if there's a swinging back and forth in political parties who's in power from one election to another. That just simply means there's, either broad consensus, or that means that it's a very tight disconsensus. You don't have supermajorities all the time. And so when you don't have supermajorities, then you're going to get periods like this. And it's the same here in the United States as it is in just about every other democracy, not just across space here in the 21st century, but across time. I teach the history of the Peloponnesian War in some of my classes. It's a war between Athens and Sparta that was 2,500 years ago. There are times in which ancient Athens rescinds a decision they made the day prior. They're like, we're going to go kill all these people in this island because they're our enemies. And then the next day, they're like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. And then they change their decision. It's so fickle. This happens all the time. And so that's sort of my general view. We're in a tight spot. We got to do our best to make sure democracy continues. But we also shouldn't despair that we're at the precipice of losing everything.
I was surprised. I loved what you said about DEI, but along with that, he rescinded a lot of accessibility services. And it strikes me that in immigration and all these areas, he's taking away very rapidly federal services, including information that we're used to getting. I'm curious I think that's a risk to our democracy, but I'm also curious, is this a privatization move? What do you think's going on? I was particularly struck by it in terms of accessibility, where people need these services. They're used to getting it from a particular channel, and it happened very rapidly. I'm curious.
Oh, I wish I had the expertise to give a prediction. It is heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking that accessibility services are, gone. So is how many millions of dollars in NIH funding, just frozen? All of it? So I don't know. How long can this last? We do have a very, I think, a very vibrant disability rights community. We have wonderful disability rights activism. I think, the question about democracy had me thinking about what form does democracy take now? 8 years ago, of course, there were a lot of protests, and there was a lot of protesting. There's less now. I wouldn't take that to mean that those who are not happy with these new policies have given up, but rather that those forms of democratic participation have become less effective than we would wish. Our attention is very valuable. Our attention can be weaponized. Protesting is a form of attention that can be weaponized against us. So I don't know how this is going to work, but I know that people will not be silent. Certainly scientists will not be silent. Universities will not just say okay to the end of all of this funding that we rely on. And I think we'll just have to see. And I wish I had a better answer, but thank you very much for bringing that forward.
Hello. So over December and I believe more recently, Trump made a variety of, I'd say, territorial claims, for lack of a better term, on the territory of Greenland and Panama. My question is, how serious is he about the territorial claims? And if he is serious, how far is he necessarily willing to go to plant an American flag over nuke? I'm not sure if I said it right, but.
This is where my Venn diagram of his sort of policy triad, it might be helpful. I don't know that he's serious so much in the sense of like this is going to be a priority number one, but it is serious in the sense of it keeps the world and his opponents distracted while he's trying to achieve other goals. He likes to be very sort of operationally unpredictable. And so to the extent that we're all screaming at each other over whether or not we should make Greenland the 51st state, well, now he's free to do other things, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy or anything else that he wants to do. And because, again, he governs really, I think, just from these instincts of like what makes him look good in the moment, like from 9 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he might change his mind depending on how he's thinking through questions. So not that serious, but if it is serious, maybe not in the ways that we think it is.
Professor Rouse, question for you. So you mentioned that, and a lot of political analysts have also seen that Democrats are like, it looks like they're losing the Latino vote, especially in this last election. And you also mentioned that a not insignificant number of them would describe themselves as Christian nationalists. So I wanted to ask, do you think the religious appeal of the Republican Party was a large part of what swayed their vote? And if that's the case, what do you think the Democratic Party can do in terms of strategy in order to win them back?
Yeah, I think that's part of the explanation of what won Republicans more Latino votes. It's not, I want to say it's not as much as the exit polls say. Exit polls are horrible at being able to predict the voting patterns of subpopulations, especially Latinos. So I would make a plug for not believing exit polls and waiting until the actual voter data files are analyzed and come out, which is usually February, March of the following year. But there's no doubt that Republicans made gains with Latinos. How big that number, I think I would challenge in terms of what it looks like. I think religion plays a part of that. There's also something that we haven't really talked about, and I would disagree with my colleague over here about the threat to democracy relative to the 1960s and 1860s. I think in some ways it's apples and oranges. We have a huge disinformation and misinformation machine going on in this country that we have never seen before. The internet is certainly an accelerant to that in ways that we have never seen before. And Latinos, by the way, are disproportionately susceptible to misinformation and disinformation for a whole host of reasons that have to do with where they get their messages from, which a lot of it is not in the United States. That plays on their fears of socialism, and that actually, ironically, as they have fled countries with strong men and what we call caudillos in Latin America, they are drawn to a strong man who's telling them in a lot of ways what they want to hear. So there's a lot of complexity to why Latinos, there's been a shift in support. I think a lot of it has to do with Latinos, not necessarily all of them, a number of them gravitating to the Republican Party, but that they have become more issue voters than they have party line voters. And so if a party at a particular time or a candidate at a particular time is telling them things that they want to hear, right? And immigration, getting back to immigration, there are many Latinos who are now closing the door behind them. There are Latinos that came here, many of them undocumented, who no longer want undocumented migrants coming to the country, right? And that's why I started my presentation with saying we can't separate the economy and immigration. They work together, right? And so, again, that's not an easy answer to the question. I do think religion is a part of it. I think many have gravitated to Christian nationalism, to prosperity gospel. All of these things are intertwined, and there are many people on this panel that know more about that than I do, but certainly religion is a part of it, but it's more complex than that.
Thank y'all for this. thank y'all for this panel. This was really insightful. I have continuing on this theme of uncertainty and going into a question of the support that Trump has. Dr. Fessenden, you raised this kind of point about like, particularly from evangelicals, like finding kind of concern about the executive order that Donald Trump issued regarding refugee status. One that stuck out to me particularly was Franklin Graham, his own kind of him being taken aback by Trump's comments and orders. But I think what I'm getting at is how stable do you think, depending on how the economy goes, how immigration, how these kinds of facets, what Trump does and what his appointees do, how stable do you imagine his support is? Like, how critical are these next few years?
Well, Trump presumably can't run for re-election, so what's critical for him are really the next 2 years, and he has to work with an extremely small majority in the House of Representatives. And so I think that it's going to be critical for his long-term agenda what happens in the next year or maximum 2. And I think that some of his policy proposals actually work against him in the short run, especially the tariffs and immigration restriction. There's every likelihood that if he does impose big tariffs on especially China, Mexico, and Canada, which are by far the United States' biggest trading partners, that could lead to significant inflation in everything from food to manufactured goods, consumer durables, everything across the board. That could really set the economy on a negative trajectory, tip the economy into recession. And I would say actually the immigration restrictions pose the same risk in certain sectors, especially construction, agriculture, where there's a lot of labor that could potentially be impacted by that. So I think that Trump's path in the next year or 2 is anything but certain. And if that does not go as well as he hopes that it will, then of course the Republican majority in the House is in danger, and then the handbrake goes on for the remainder of his presidency, not to mention the next presidential election will be up for grabs. So I think that a lot of action is going to happen here in the next 6 to 12 months. And it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. But as you can probably tell from my comments, I think that if he does a lot of the things that he thinks he wants to do, that they're going to end up not going particularly well for him in the economy. I forgot to mention interest rates. If he drives up inflation, the Fed is going to have to respond, and that's going to be even worse for the economy. So I think it's what looks like a resounding victory at this point could quite quickly turn into a relatively hairy situation for the Trump administration.
Somewhat touching on what you just said, considering the first 100 days in a presidency are usually... Sorry, is it working? Considering the first 100 days in a presidency are usually the most effective, but Trump will not be running for re-election, we hope. What do you all think will be his most important focus, or what will be a defining moment in his administration?
I was just thinking that, if part of what's tricky about these time-based questions is it just seems we get overly focused on the moment. I just draw your attention to one thing. We're talking about, if we dial back just a couple of months ago, one of the core issues related to democracy in America was electoral integrity, as it was called. It's gone. Now, elections have all kinds of issues, sure, but it's gone. I draw attention because I think that who knows what's going to happen in the 100 days that's going to really stick. We're going to hear a lot of bombast. We're going to hear a lot of executive orders. I mean, this is part of the plan. This is an administration that came into power with a lot of planning. Probably one of the most dangerous long-term things will be the degree to which the administration is capable of hollowing out staffers who've been there for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of anti-government sentiment in our country, but most people in the government just do these jobs and they produce things, and it's nowhere near as contentious or even as interesting as debate might suggest. But you can do damage to that. I mean, we've already seen, in just in the first weeks, key people leaving, the State Department and other some key movements in Department of Justice. Those sorts of changes. I don't know if they're going to get if they're going to be the first 100-day big headlines, but it's very, very hard to bring people. When you lose that level of competency, it's built up over many, many years, and some of that might really do damage. And one person brought up an issue about information. It's also possible the president has an enormous ability to change the way government agencies gather and diffuse information. And that could really do harm in ways that have long-term impacts. It may not be headline grabbing. It may not be a big thing in 100 days, but it can affect issues. But I guess I would also say that, we don't know. I don't want to just hit on this, but we really don't know. And we don't even know at what point a serious reflection is viable. One of the most fascinating things about this election was how not particularly engaged it was of a reflection of the first term of the person who's currently president. It's a fascinating thing. It became presented as this almost magical time of great success in the public imagination, and that's an enormous achievement. It's an extraordinary political achievement. It had a lot to do with I think, the victory. So I guess what I mean to say is whatever happens in the first 100 days may not be the way those 100 days are remembered, talked about, considered.
A quick two-finger on this, because I think it goes precisely to what Stella said about disinformation and misinformation. Again, we don't know, but we also have a tendency to spend most of our time on social media not reading the newspaper. If you look at the data on who's reading the paper relative to periods of time, across the board, every demographic age from 18 to senior citizens are reading the newspaper less. This matters because when you're on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, everything is eternal state of present. And so you're in this kind of flight or flight mode all day, and you don't even realize that you have been arguing about one thing at 9 a.m. and you've moved to the next thing, you move to the next thing. Meanwhile, you don't notice the big trends, and it's only in retrospect that you're able to look back. The reason we're susceptible to misinformation and disinformation is because we don't turn our phones off. I have social media. I'm not anti-social media, but also just take the time in the morning or the evening to read a long-form newspaper or magazine. ASU gives students and staff and faculty the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, right? Center left, center right. It's a great, sit down and read 3 articles from each. It doesn't matter which ones. Just figure out what's going on in the world. Because I think in retrospect, we will then see, oh, wow, I thought this was going to be the most important thing in the first 100 days, but now that it's after the midterms, and I think a lot of people misunderstand or don't realize what Henry has pointed out, once we get past the midterms, everyone's going to be thinking about 2028. And Trump's influence is going to wane very fast. He'll continue to have influence as the outgoing president, but whoever's trying to be next in line, whether it's J.D. Vance or Rubio or Youngkin or whomever else, same with the Democratic Party, whoever's going to sort of step in to fill that void, that's suddenly going to be the main national priority. And so we're going to move on to the next big present debate. And so taking the time to think a little bit broaden our own temporal horizons and reflect on these things can be very, very helpful for thinking about how that 100 days is or is not successful, because I don't think we know either. I don't think anybody knows. We're only going to really know in hindsight.
So we are at time, but panel, if you're willing, I think if we can take these last 3 questions, and we'll close it there. Sure, yeah. You are free to go. If you so desire, we will not keep you. We will not keep you by force. We will not detain you. But panel, if you're willing, let's take these last 3 questions, and please feel free to sit and listen to the conversation.
And students, feel free to grab a cookie on your way out in the back. So I'm just reading this question from an online viewer. The panel, this is their question. The panel hasn't really zeroed in on the imperialistic themes and proposals Trump made on Monday. From a space of international cooperation, How likely does the panel feel that Trump's imperialistic ambitions will succeed? That's from an ASU doctoral student. So.
I have the mic, so I'll go first. I think much like with the Greenland, ideas, like it helps him feel better about how he is in any given day. It's unclear, I think, how successful he's going to be, because if you take the whole of what all of us have been saying, there's a lot that any given president has to do or wants to do or is trying to do, and so there's only so much like mental cognitive bandwidth in any presidential administration. Trump's, Biden's, doesn't matter, whoever's next, and so he's only going to get so far until he runs up against the narrow majority in Congress, the shift to 2028 after the midterms, the fact that other things happen in the world independent of whatever it is that we Americans think is most important. And so I think the tendency is there. I think it's real and legitimate. It's just not clear to me how successful he's going to be once things actually get rolling down the line.
I guess I want to take some issue with this, Luke, in that when has Trump not having his own party in the Senate or in the House ever stopped him from taking very, very robust actions, from exceeding as far as humanly possible the use of the executive branch, even if it means hollowing it out so that there are fewer and fewer people who can say no and stop them. So I think it's important to remember the political and electoral calendar, but I don't want to underestimate in some ways just how different this president is in trying to and how aggressive he is about using executive power. And I also want to say I think that is one of the things that makes this different than 1968, which was 2 years before I was born, at least. So for those of this generational perspective is important. I mean, my kids have never grown up in a political climate where they've seen anything else other than Donald Trump as the Republican candidate for politics. Like, that's normal for them. And if you grew up when I did, that's not normal at all. It's really, really different because, yes, there was a protester killed protesters killed at Kent State. But, to have someone in the Oval Office who's saying, can't you shoot the protesters in the legs, is a very, very different approach. And that's not quite the same. So I think that's worth calling out. So.
Extremely briefly, I just wanted to talk about, I'm not sure if it's about his imperialistic tendencies, but the rest of the world's response to Trump has been different to the first time. Even Keir Starmer, the Labour Prime Minister of the UK, wants good relations with Trump. The German government has been relatively muted, and the CDU, Conservative Chancellor candidate, they're having an election in February, has already made statements saying that German companies should no longer be investing in China, i.e. he is already preemptively trying to come around to what he thinks Trump wants from him. Trump is taking over in the United States when, as weak or as shaky as I think the American economy is, every other advanced country in the world's economy is far weaker. So Trump is taking over at a time when the American economy and American power is relatively predominant for reasons completely unrelated to Trump. And so I think that's an interesting and important part of the Trump presidency, is that the view from the outside, from the rest of the world, is very different to in 2016.
Hi, I'm a secondary education student here, and I'm also a mother. I have several teenagers that I'm around all the time that feel erased by Trump's statements about gender and that there's only a man and there's a woman. And I'm wondering about how me going into the teaching profession, entering into the classroom, am I going to get in trouble by allowing students to use whatever gender pronouns they feel comfortable with? And also your thoughts on how we can best support our youth growing up.
Yeah, I wish those weren't legitimate fears and worries, but I think that they are. And I look at who are the heroes in our country now. Teachers certainly, I think, are way way up there. Teachers who really go in every day and nurture and cultivate their students' lives and learning and dignity. From early in the morning till late in the afternoon, you are doing an incredible service to all of us. So my sense as a mom, watching my own kids and their teachers, is that teachers are called to do what they do because they are not, or they are seldom on board with directives that might be coming down. And so I think we have to support our teachers in imagining differently and in treating all students who are our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors' children, with absolute respect and dignity. I hope someday there will be a unit on the executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. I hope that this will be deconstructed in classrooms across the land. The best that the executive order can do at defining gender in a binary way from conception is to write that female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. Male means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. Now, I'm not on Twitter, but I do check in on Blue Sky because I think people have a much better sense of humor there. And there are all sorts of wonderful conversations there about, so everyone is a woman, really. I mean, we're all women at conception. And thank goodness we finally have a Madam President. It just happens to be Donald Trump. So I think that we, responding with humor to some of this stuff is important. Rallying around our parents, our teachers, our kids is going to be super, super important. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing as a mom and as a teacher.
I guess I'm an older student. I was around in '68 in school. But I remember then there were protests. Some of us read about them, some of us were there, and some have seen them or saw them. Given the rhetoric we heard during the campaign and all of your comments today, I'm wondering, are we going to see active public protests as we did in his last administration? Or do you think people are going to close the doors, or are they going to stay behind the doors in the next several months?
Just really quickly, I think we're going to see different kinds of protests because we saw what happened when we all hit the streets. I think that I see people figuring out what to do from where we are. So you're a faith leader, you preach. You're a lawyer, you advocate. You're a teacher, you take care of your students. That might be more effective for some of us than carrying signs. I remember, my colleagues and I would say, do you have any more cardboard boxes? I'm running out of cardboard for my signs. Everything seemed to be an occasion for protest. And some of us feel that wasn't as effective as we would have liked. So I think it might be different. Protests might look different now. We might come up with different ways to do it.
I was just going to add, I don't think anybody would have foreseen that there was going to be a major eruption that became the Black Lives Matter movement when it did. So we don't know, we can't say, I would say we don't know and we can't say. So, but people will pay attention, and that's a good thing, and people will respond and they will march. My biggest hope for the next administration, for this administration, is that there won't be violence. That's really my biggest hope, because I think, again, one of the things that happens and is fair game, as Luke is saying, in a democracy is to contest what you're all about. Who are we? Who are we as a people? What are our principles? What are we going to be guided by? What are we going to whom are we going to support and include? Whom are we going to exclude? All of that's fair game. But what sets the boundaries, the perimeter of democracy, is violence. And we almost lost it one time in the Civil War, and we lost it at many smaller battles involving civil rights. And there has been violence in the past. And there's one of the real concerns I have. I mean, one of the things you can say in support of President Trump's first administration is that he was an isolationist. And in some ways that meant a reluctance to use force, even when many of us thought it should be used overseas. But that does not extend to the domestic sphere. And there seems to be a real penchant and respect for aggression, for the use of violence to resolve matters. And you see that in the releasing of 1,500 people who used violence and many of whom used violence on January 6th. You see it in all of the rhetoric about, lock them up and don't be too soft on them, and all of these kinds of things. You see it in the rescinding of concerns about the rules of war among U.S. soldiers. That's a huge issue that's facing our military right now, and that is going to be very, very disruptive. So my hope is that in all of this there won't be violence, or there won't be too much of it.
Thank you. I'm Ihda. I'm a student in religious studies. I have a question. I think religion and politics should be separated, but in this conference we talk about religion and politics. So what is the reason? Thank you.
That's a topic for our next forum.
I keep jumping into the fray. We often have a lot of interesting views about religion and politics in America. The most common one that most people know is this wall of separation sort of metaphor that appears nowhere in the Declaration or the U.S. Constitution. It's something that Jefferson wrote in a letter to a group of Danbury Baptists who were more concerned, who wanted that wall because they wanted the wall of separation to protect religion from politics corrupting religion. And we've sort of, over the last 2 centuries, has sort of inverted that. But every president, or at least a lot of our most prominent presidents that we know of, Democrat and Republican, Whig, have invoked religion and have invoked God. Go read Lincoln or Washington's Thanksgiving proclamations. There's a sense in which religion is something that does sort of bind people together and helps us realize that there's a higher purpose to the world. That even somebody who is not religious, who might be a sort of secular atheist, can acknowledge that it has a kind of public role. This is something that Alexis de Tocqueville noted in his famous book on American democracy about how it affects us. And America's in this unique place because on the one hand, we don't have formal established religion. They have established churches in Europe. They have a different view of secularism. They're not allowed to make religious arguments in the public sphere in a lot of those countries. We are the other way around. We don't have established religion, but we welcome and encourage religious moral arguments over matters of public policy. And so I think that's sort of a unique thing about the United States. I generally welcome the messiness of that, if you've gathered anything from my comments. And there are no easy answers to this, but that's sort of where I stand on that.
I just want to say thank you so much for your question. I would say, as a professor of religious studies who thinks a lot about politics, none of us up here are advocating for a religious public sphere or a particular relationship of religion and politics. Rather, we're observing the ways that religion and politics are not separated, despite what some of our politicians and pundits may promote or say or believe. So we are looking at the ways that they are related and thinking about implications for those various relationships.
With that, I think that's a great place to leave it with a view on our democracy and the relationship of religion and politics. So thanks so much this afternoon to Stella, Daniel, Luke, Henry, Tracy, and John, as well as to each of you in attendance. I know that there were many important issues that we only briefly touched on or didn't even get to. Climate change, AI, public health, or even the price of eggs. But I hope that today's conversation sparks more discussion on these and other issues. So I hope that you've enjoyed this afternoon's event, and I hope you'll join us at our future events. And of course, consider becoming part of our community of financial supporters. Most importantly, though, I hope that our time together this afternoon prepared and inspired you to continue to engage with us and with the new administration in the work of making America an ever more perfect union. Thank you. Have a great rest of the evening, and please join us in the lobby for some refreshments.